30 nights straight, Evan Maddox slept at his desk to save a $240 million airport system. When it passed every acceptance test, all he wanted was the $110,000 bonus in his contract, enough to keep the house where his daughter had grown up, the last place holding her mother's memory. But his manager, Trent Halbrook, decided a bowl of congee eaten at 2 in the morning was reason enough to strip the bonus entirely and sign his own name across the success report. Evan packed his things. At that moment, the billionaire client walked in, looked around the room, and asked, "Where is the person who actually built this?" Stay until the very end to see how one small bowl of soup exposed an entire empire of deception. Denver sits a mile above sea level, and on most mornings the light comes in flat and cold across the glass towers of the financial district, indifferent to whoever is burning themselves out inside them. Carrington Systems occupied the upper floors of one such tower, and in the weeks leading up to the final delivery of Aegis Flow, those upper floors never went fully dark. Aegis Flow was not a simple piece of software. It was the nervous system of Blackwell International Airport, designed to synchronize gate assignments, ground vehicle dispatch, baggage handling, fueling schedules, and emergency alerts across a single unified platform, replacing 6 separate legacy systems that had spent years refusing to communicate with one another. The contract was worth $240 million over 10 years, and the penalty clause for a late delivery was severe enough to erase Carrington's profit margin for the entire fiscal year. Trent Halbrook had made sure everyone on the project understood exactly how much was at stake, while quietly ensuring that nobody looked too carefully at the decisions that had made the deadline this tight in the first place. 3 months earlier, Trent had approved a staffing cut that reduced the engineering team by 1/3, presenting it to the executive committee as a sign of efficient project management and strong cost discipline. The cut looked clean on paper and earned him a favorable line in a quarterly report. What it did to the actual architecture was less photogenic. Without enough hands to build the integration layer properly the first time, the modules began to drift, each team solving its own local problem without a shared framework connecting them. And by the time the gaps became visible in testing, the calendar had already eaten most of the buffer Evan had planned for exactly this kind of structural failure. Trent's response was to call an emergency meeting, describe the situation as an unexpected technical challenge, and direct his engineers to work whatever hours were necessary to close the gap before anyone outside the room found out. He framed it as a team rallying together. Evan recognized it as damage control for a mistake that was never his to own. Evan proposed abandoning the patchwork approach entirely and rebuilding the data synchronization layer from scratch, a harder solution but the only one that would hold under production load. It would require long nights, it would require precision, and it would require Evan to hold the entire architecture in his head simultaneously, 'cause no one else on the team had the full picture. Trent agreed to the plan but declined to add a single additional resource, which meant Evan was effectively agreeing to carry the project on his own back for the remaining 30 days. He accepted without complaint, because the alternative was watching something he had designed carefully get ruined by a fix it was never built to absorb. The hours stretched from late evenings into full nights, from full nights into a rhythm where the difference between Tuesday and Wednesday ceased to mean anything beyond which simulation batch was currently running. Sloane noticed. She was 16 and observant in the quiet, watching way of someone who had already learned that adults sometimes protected children by staying silent about the things that frightened them most. She saw the hollows forming under her father's eyes when he came home for a few hours on Saturday afternoon, saw the way he moved through the kitchen as though he was navigating from memory rather than presence, saw him check his phone during dinner with a reflex that had nothing to do with the food in front of him. Evan told her the project bonus would make everything stable again, and she believed him because she had no reason not to, and because the alternative, asking directly about the mortgage notices she had found in the kitchen drawer 6 weeks earlier, felt like a door she was not yet ready to open. The contract annex was explicit: $110,000, payable to Evan Maddox upon successful completion of all acceptance benchmarks for the core architecture redesign. He had read that clause more than once in the past month. It was the number between his family and the bank. What Evan did not know was that Trent had already begun moving that number elsewhere. 2 weeks before the project's final push, Trent submitted a quiet internal request to reattribute the incentive payment from Evan's name to a discretionary leadership pool. The paperwork cited a pending disciplinary matter. The disciplinary matter did not yet exist. Evan was not working alone in any absolute sense. Nolan Beckett coordinated the testing cycles, and the remaining engineers handled their assigned modules, but there was a ceiling to what any of them could see, and only Evan stood above it. The system had more than 100 distinct operational handoffs. A gate reassignment triggered by a delayed inbound flight needed to propagate through the ground vehicle scheduler, the baggage rerouting logic, the fueling sequence adjuster, and the airline notification interface within a window narrow enough that a human dispatcher would have no time to catch a failure manually. Evan had designed what he called the redundancy bridge layer, a secondary synchronization path that allowed the airport to keep functioning if any single server or data feed dropped without warning. It was not glamorous engineering. It did not appear in the sales deck, but it was the piece that turned a demonstration system into something that could actually run a real airport on a bad day. Trent reviewed the architecture during a mid-project checkpoint and declared the redundancy bridge layer an unnecessary complication that was adding time without adding value. He suggested removing it to recover 2 days on the schedule. Evan declined, calmly and completely, explaining that without the layer, any single point failure in the primary path would cascade through the entire system, potentially leaving gate controllers, fueling crews, and baggage teams operating from contradictory information simultaneously. Trent let the matter drop, but not without the particular kind of silence that meant the conversation was being filed away rather than resolved. The layer stayed in. The schedule slipped by 2 days anyway, for unrelated reasons, and Trent found a different line item to blame it on. By the final week, Evan's body had begun to communicate its objections through the only channel he was leaving open: pain. The coffee he was drinking instead of sleeping had produced a persistent ache in his stomach that sharpened every time he sat down and faded when he was moving, which meant he was moving as often as possible, pacing the length of the server room during compile cycles, and standing at his workstation rather than sitting. Nolan brought him food when he remembered, which was not often enough. One evening, Sloan sent a delivery driver to the building with a container of plain white rice porridge. She had called ahead to make sure the front desk would accept it, because she had read somewhere that it was easy on a damaged stomach, and she was 16 years old and out of better options for looking after her father from 12 miles away. Evan ate a few spoonfuls at the control console while a stress simulation ran, using the lid as a bowl because he did not want to step away from the screen long enough to find a proper one. The operations room had a posted rule prohibiting food in the workspace, a standard policy in controlled environments. Evan knew the rule. He had not intended to make an exception so much as he had simply stopped having enough attention left over for anything that was not the system in front of him. Trent walked in at 2:14 in the morning, took in the scene, and raised his phone. Evan looked up, acknowledged the violation, and immediately put the container away. Trent said nothing beyond a mild observation about workplace standards. He left without escalating. Evan returned to the simulation, and by the time the results came back clean, he had already forgotten about it. 3 days later, Aegis Flow cleared its full acceptance battery. 10,000 simulated flight scenarios run across 2 consecutive days. Testing gate conflicts, emergency diversions, simultaneous system restarts, and partial data feed failures, each one resolved within the required response window. The numbers were better than the contract required. Nolan sent Evan a message that said simply, "It held," and Evan sat for a moment in the empty room with the monitors still running and understood that it had. Trent pulled his own report from the printer that same afternoon, the one that listed him as lead solution architect for the Aegis Flow redesign. Evan's name appeared nowhere on the title page. The financial services office at Carrington occupied a cluster of glass-fronted rooms on the 22nd floor, staffed by people who dealt in numbers rather than outcomes, and who had learned not to ask too many questions about the circumstances behind the documents they processed. Evan arrived there, the morning after the acceptance results were confirmed, expecting a brief administrative exchange about payment timing. What he received instead was the information that he had been removed from the incentive program due to a documented violation of operational area conduct protocols. The representative was sympathetic in the way that people are sympathetic when they are reading from a decision made by someone else and have no stake in whether it holds. Evan asked to see the disciplinary record. It contained one item: the photograph from 2:14 in the morning. There was no prior written warning. There was no record of damage or security risk. There was no opportunity for a response. Trent received Evan in his office that afternoon with the relaxed posture of someone who has already won an argument. He explained that bonus payments of this nature were discretionary at the management level, that the conduct policy existed for important reasons, and that an employee who demonstrated poor judgment in a sensitive operational environment was not the profile the company wanted to reward for leadership contributions. Evan placed the contract annex on the desk between them and pointed to the language that linked the payment to specific technical deliverables, architecture performance benchmarks, not behavioral assessments. Trent acknowledged the document and explained that the company reserved the right to adjust discretionary compensation in light of circumstances that created legal exposure, and that Evan's pattern of unauthorized overtime also fell into that category. The phrase unauthorized overtime landed in the room with the particular quality of something designed to disorient rather than describe. Evan had the emails, 31 separate written communications from Trent himself directing him to remain on site until specific milestones were reached, some of them sent after midnight. Trent did not dispute the emails. He restated the company's position. Evan filed an internal grievance that afternoon and received an automated response 4 days later informing him that the compensation adjustment had been finalized. The $110,000 had been transferred to the management performance pool. The allocation breakdown showed $82,000 awarded to Trent Halbrook under the category of crisis leadership, $18,000 distributed among 2 senior program managers, and $10,000 logged as retention support expenses. On the same evening he read that allocation breakdown, Evan received a letter from the bank stating that the mortgage on his house had entered default status and that he had 14 days to bring the account current or surrender the property to foreclosure proceedings. The letter was addressed to him alone, because it had always been addressed to him alone, for 4 years now. The Aegis Flow handover ceremony was held in the main operations center at Blackwell International, in a room dominated by a wall of live display screens showing real-time gate status across all 3 concourses. Helena Carrington arrived with the board, several journalists, and a small complement of city officials who had been invited because a project of this scale in Denver generated the kind of goodwill that city officials found useful. August Blackwell's team had confirmed his attendance for the afternoon session. Trent took the podium in the morning briefing and delivered a prepared account of the previous 30 days that featured a recurring motif of himself as the steadying presence who had held the team together through a difficult technical reconfiguration. He described sleeping at the office on multiple occasions. His access logs showed he had been in the building past midnight on 2 nights out of 30. Evan and Nolan sat near the back of the room, behind 3 rows of project contractors, whose names had also not appeared in the morning's introduction. Before the ceremony began, Trent had pulled Evan aside with a document that described itself as a standard intellectual property acknowledgement, standard in the same way that any document is standard when it serves the interests of the person presenting it. The language transferred all architectural attribution for the Aegis Flow redesign to Carrington Systems and listed Trent Halbrook as the originating design authority. Evan signed the section that covered work product ownership, which he had never disputed. Everything he had built belonged to the company. That was not the question, and declined to sign the section that identified Trent as the creator of the core architecture. Trent's expression did not change in any way that would have been visible to a casual observer. He told Evan his building access would be suspended immediately for failure to cooperate with standard off-boarding procedures, and asked him to leave the operations area. A security officer materialized with the particular promptness that suggested he had been waiting nearby. Evan did not raise his voice. He gathered the papers he had brought with him, a personal notebook, an external drive he had never used on company systems, and a framed photograph of Sloan that he kept on the corner of whatever desk he happened to be occupying, and walked toward the exit. He was halfway across the operations floor when August Blackwell came through the main entrance, 40 minutes ahead of his scheduled arrival, accompanied by 2 members of his infrastructure team, who had spent the previous week reviewing every page of the technical documentation package. August had read the redundancy bridge layer specification 3 times. He had specifically wanted to speak with whoever had written the explanatory section, because the voice in those pages was technically precise in a way that was categorically different from the executive summary that preceded them. And August Blackwell had spent 40 years learning to notice exactly that kind of discontinuity. He asked Helena, who had authored the core architecture. She directed the question toward Trent. Trent stepped forward. August asked him 3 technical questions about the synchronization logic. Not hostile questions, not trick questions, the kind of basic clarifying questions any competent architect would answer in under a minute. Trent produced an answer to the first one that was technically adjacent to correct. He had no answer to the second. He began a sentence in response to the third and did not finish it. August looked across the room toward the security officer walking Evan toward the exit doors and asked, with the particular quietness of a man who does not raise his voice because he has never needed to, why the only person in the room who appeared capable of answering his questions was currently being removed from it. Trent recovered quickly, the way people do when they have spent a career learning to manage the surface of situations rather than their depth. He told Helena, privately, that Evan was a technically skilled employee who had become disruptive after a legitimate disciplinary action, that the timing of his objections was consistent with someone attempting to use a high-visibility moment as leverage, and that allowing him back into the operations area would validate exactly that kind of behavior. Helena was listening with the careful neutrality of someone who had not yet decided which version of events she believed. August, meanwhile, had moved to a terminal with Rebecca Sloan to review the morning's handover status. The live activation sequence had already begun. Aegis flow was going online across the full airport, touching real gates with real aircraft and real schedules for the first time. For approximately 4 minutes, everything looked exactly as it should. Then the gate assignment feed for Concourse B began to lag. Not by much, not enough to trigger an immediate alarm, but enough that 2 update cycles passed without a refresh, and a conflict emerged. 2 aircraft were shown as candidates for the same gate during overlapping windows. The automated conflict resolution protocol that should have flagged the issue and proposed a reassignment did not fire. The redundancy bridge layer, which had been designed precisely to catch this category of failure, was not responding. Rebecca called for a partial rollback on Concourse B and began moving several departure sequences to manual coordination while her team assessed the scope. No aircraft were in danger. No passengers were at risk, but the cascade potential was real. In an airport running at capacity, a gate conflict that went unresolved for more than a few minutes could produce a chain of delays that would take hours to unwind. Trent, who needed an explanation faster than he needed an accurate one, announced that the failure was located in the synchronization layer Evan had built. Nolan Beckett, who had been standing at a monitoring station since the activation began, pulled the changelog for the previous 18 hours and found something that had not been in the log the previous evening. At 11:43 the night before, a configuration update had been pushed to the production environment, not through the standard change control process, not with a test signature, not with any of the approval documentation the contract required. The update had been pushed using administrator-level credentials assigned to Trent Halbrook. The stated purpose was a performance optimization for the display refresh rate. The actual effect included the disabling of several internal alert flags, which Trent had apparently wanted to suppress, so that the morning's demonstration would appear cleaner and faster on the monitoring screens. What he had not known was that 3 of those alert flags served as handshake signals between the primary coordination engine and the redundancy bridge layer. Cutting them had silently severed the connection between the 2 halves of the system. August told Trent he wanted Evan back in the room. Trent explained calmly that a suspended employee could not be granted access to a secured operational environment. August replied that the environment belonged to Blackwell Infrastructure Dominion, that the contract defined the operational integrity standards, and that if Carrington Systems was currently unable to protect those standards, he would treat the contract as materially breached and initiate the suspension clause within the hour. Helena made the call. Evan answered it in the parking structure, standing beside his car, with his notebook and his photograph and his external drive. and agreed to come back on the condition that every instruction he gave, every system he touched, and every change made during the recovery process would be logged in writing with timestamps and attributed correctly. When he sat down at the terminal and pulled up the configuration history, the unauthorized update was exactly where Nolan said it was. Embedded inside it, alongside Trent's administrator signature, was a code module Evan did not recognize, a segment that had not been in any version of Aegis Flow he had ever seen. Evan did not attempt to restore the full system immediately, because attempting to restore the full system immediately would have been the wrong decision, and Evan made very few wrong decisions when he understood what he was working with. He partitioned the airport into 3 operational zones, stabilized the aircraft already on approach by freezing their gate assignments at the last confirmed state, and shifted the departures that had not yet pushed back to a simplified fallback schedule that removed them from the automated sequencing entirely until the core path was clean. Rebecca coordinated the ground teams in real time, translating the technical partitions into operational language that her dispatchers could act on. The communication between them was efficient in the way that communication between 2 people who both understand the actual problem tends to be. No excess, no theater, just the sequence of necessary actions moving forward. Nolan restored the last verified build from the night before the unauthorized update. The redundancy bridge layer came back online within 40 minutes of Evan sitting down. The airport never reached a full ground stop. Several flights accumulated delays in the 15 to 30-minute range, and Concourse B operated at reduced throughput for just under an hour. But the event that had been building toward a cascading operational failure was contained and then reversed. When August asked how it was possible for the system's most critical safety component to be disabled without triggering any kind of access control review, Evan explained, without inflection, that Trent had granted himself the highest level of administrative privilege on the production environment, and had done so by submitting a request to a vendor portal that bypassed Carrington's internal review process. The server logs showed exactly when the privilege escalation had occurred, exactly what had been changed, and exactly whose credentials had authorized each action. Trent's response was to suggest that Evan had designed the system with deliberately inadequate access controls so that only he could manage it safely, a kind of engineered dependency that created job security by making failure the alternative to keeping him employed. It was a coherent-sounding argument in the way that certain arguments are coherent-sounding when constructed backwards from a desired conclusion. Evan did not respond to it verbally. He opened the server log on the main display and let the timestamps and account identifiers speak in the format that data speaks: precise, sequential, indifferent to interpretation. Helena looked at the log for a long moment. She looked at Trent. She suspended him from the project on the spot and transferred temporary technical oversight to Evan pending a formal review. Evan accepted the temporary role and declined the permanent one, saying he would not return to a standing position at Carrington until the bonus dispute and the alteration of the project record had been reviewed by an independent investigator. Avery Caldwell, Carrington's compliance director, had been in the room for the last 40 minutes, taking notes. She had already begun to form a list of questions that had nothing to do with the gate conflict. The code module embedded in Trent's unauthorized update contained external transmission protocols, functions that would, under certain triggering conditions, route a copy of operational data to a server address outside the Carrington network. The address resolved to a hosting provider in a commercial data center. The registration for that hosting account was listed under a company name that Avery had not seen before. She wrote it down and moved it to the top of her list. Avery's investigation began with a simple question. Was the disciplinary basis for removing Evan from the incentive program procedurally valid? The photograph had been taken at 2:14 in the morning during an overtime shift that Trent had mandated in writing. The operational area conduct policy prohibited food in controlled environments, which was a reasonable rule for reasons of equipment protection and contamination prevention. The policy also specified, in Section 4 of the disciplinary framework, that a first violation of a minor conduct rule resulted in a documented verbal warning, that a written warning followed a second violation, and that financial penalties, including exclusion from incentive compensation, applied only in cases of documented harm, repeated violations, or deliberate disregard. Evan had no prior violations of any kind in his 6 years at Carrington. He had not been issued a verbal warning. The documentation removing him from the bonus program had been created 14 days before Trent took the photograph. The timestamp was not a rounding error. It was not an administrative artifact. The paperwork had been filed on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 full weeks before the Tuesday morning, when Evan sat at a control console with a container of rice porridge at 2 in the morning. Trent had decided to take Evan's bonus before the reason existed. He had then gone looking for a reason and photographed the first one he found. Conrad Wainwright, who had co-signed the compensation adjustment, told Avery he had approved it based on a 1-paragraph summary from Trent. Without reviewing the contract annex, the disciplinary timeline, or the section of the conduct policy that governed financial penalties. He said this with the defeated honesty of someone who has recognized, too late, that efficiency and due diligence are not the same thing. The flow of the $110,000 was legible once Avery had the bank records. $82,000 had been paid to Trent as a direct performance bonus. $18,000 had been divided between 2 program managers who had contributed meaningfully to the project, but whose roles bore no relationship to the architecture, work the incentive was created to reward. $10,000 had been logged as retention and transition expenses, a category that could be stretched to cover almost anything if nobody looked carefully. When Avery looked carefully, she found that several of the vendors associated with those retention expenses shared billing infrastructure with a holding company registered in the name of Trent Halbrook's brother-in-law. The external data server linked to the code module in the unauthorized update also resolved, after several layers of registration, to an entity connected to the same family network. Trent had not only taken Evan's bonus, he had arranged a contract with a vendor he had a financial relationship with, embedded that vendor's code in a critical infrastructure system without authorization, and concealed both the relationship and the code from the client, who was paying $240 million to receive a secure and audited system. Avery called Helena directly rather than sending a written report, because some findings change the nature of a conversation in ways that are better handled in real time. Sloan was in the kitchen when Evan came home that evening, later than she had expected. He sat down at the table, and she could see that something had shifted, not resolved, not finished, but moved, the way a boulder moves when the ground beneath it finally gives way. She knew about the bonus. She had figured it out from fragments, an overheard phone call, a bank envelope she had not meant to see. She told him she was sorry about the soup, that she had not meant to give anyone a reason to use against him. Evan shook his head. and told her the soup had nothing to do with what had happened to him, that the reason had been manufactured before the soup existed, that the person who had taken his money had not needed a real reason, only a photograph of one, and that the only honest place to locate the fault was in the decision to treat another person's dedication as raw material for personal profit. He said it plainly, without anger, the way someone speaks when they have moved past the phase of fury into something quieter and more durable. The next morning, Trent filed a counter-complaint with Carrington's legal team, alleging that Evan had deliberately destabilized the live system during the handover event in order to reassert control over the project and position himself for a financial claim. He attached a fragment of an email. The email fragment showed a sentence reading, "Without me, the bridge layer won't function." Presented without the sentences before and after it, the sentence read as a threat, an employee with privileged access to critical infrastructure signaling that his removal would produce consequences. Presented in context, with the 40-word paragraph it had been extracted from. It was a technical warning Evan had sent to Trent 3 weeks earlier, urging him to begin cross-training a second engineer before the project went live, because no system of that complexity should exist with a single point of human failure any more than it should exist with a single point of technical failure. The difference between the two readings was approximately 30 words. Trent's communication firm distributed the fragment to 2 technology journalists and a local business news outlet. On the same morning, the counter-complaint was filed, framing it as evidence that a disgruntled employee was leveraging infrastructure access to extract financial concessions from a major employer. The story had enough surface plausibility to circulate for a full news cycle before anyone examined the original email. Carrington's board, concerned about reputational damage during an active contract dispute, asked Helena to place both Evan and Trent on administrative leave while an independent review was conducted. Helena agreed to Trent's suspension without hesitation. She pushed back on Evans, arguing that removing him from the system stabilization phase created operational risk at the airport. August agreed with her position but offered a compromise. An independent technical auditing firm would be brought in to verify the system, review the incident timeline, and assess whether Evan had played any role in creating the conditions that led to the handover failure. Evan consented to the audit without conditions. He handed over his company laptop, his system credentials, his project documentation, and his personal notes from the entire 30-day build period. He had not retained any proprietary code. He had not installed any remote access mechanisms. He had not deleted a single file when he walked out of the building on the morning of the handover. The auditors found all of his records intact and in the condition of someone who had never expected to need them as evidence. Nolan provided complete copies of every email chain, including the 31 overtime directives and a separate thread in which Evan had documented, repeatedly and with increasing specificity, his concern about Trent's administrator access level and the absence of any review process governing production environment changes. The auditors also found, inside the unauthorized code module, transmission protocols that had been actively running during the 4 days between the module's installation and the handover event. The destination server had received data packets during that window. The content of those packets had not yet been fully analyzed, but the architecture was consistent with an operational data exfiltration tool, something that could, over time, build a detailed picture of how Blackwell International's coordination system functioned and where its vulnerabilities were. No evidence of passenger personal data transmission had been found. The potential for harm was real and documented. Trent had known about the module's presence for at least 3 weeks and had not disclosed it to the client, to Carrington's security team, or to the compliance office. The audit report ran to 68 pages. Its conclusions were unambiguous. The last finding on the summary page noted that the email fragment distributed to the press had been generated by cropping a paragraph whose full text was available in the company's message archive, and that the original message was inconsistent with any interpretation involving coercion or threat. August requested a meeting. He did not request it, he convened it, in the way that people convene things when they own the building the meeting is being held in. Helena attended with Carrington's general counsel and the 2 board members who had been most vocal about managing the reputational exposure. The auditing firm's lead presented a compressed version of their findings. Conrad Wainwright was present and had brought with him the look of someone who has spent several days preparing to say things he should have said earlier. Trent had retained a lawyer who had advised him to attend and present his own account directly, an instinct for the high-wire act that had served him well for 2 decades of corporate maneuvering. He described his decisions in the language of stewardship, budget discipline, schedule management, protecting the company's contractual commitments, and reserved his most polished rhetoric for the argument that Evans' extraordinary contribution, while genuine, did not entitle him to circumvent the management structures that made that contribution possible. He said, directly, that technical excellence and organizational accountability were different competencies, and that it was possible to be exceptional at one while being unsuited for the other. He did not say Evan had done nothing. He argued that credit and compensation should flow through the organizational hierarchy rather than around it. August waited until Trent had finished. He asked a question. He wanted to know specifically who had identified that the original architecture could not scale to production load. He wanted to know who had designed the redundancy bridge layer. He wanted to know who had written the recovery procedures. He wanted to know who had remained in the building for 30 consecutive nights until the acceptance tests cleared. And he wanted to know who had walked back into the operations center after being suspended and stabilized the live system in under an hour without losing a single aircraft. Trent had a partial answer to the 4th question and no useful answer to any of the others. August then opened the contract. The service agreement between Blackwell Infrastructure Dominion and Carrington Systems included a standard clause requiring the vendor to accurately disclose all key personnel and all subcontractors with access to protected operational systems. Trent's brother-in-law's company had never been disclosed. The code it provided had been embedded in a live production environment without authorization. The operational data it had transmitted during its 4 days of active running constituted a potential breach of the data security provisions that the contract took very seriously, as data security provisions in airport infrastructure contracts tend to do. August said he was not terminating the contract because several hundred people who had nothing to do with Trent's decisions would bear the consequences of that action, and because the airport's operations had ultimately been protected rather than destroyed, and because the system, when functioning as its architect intended, performed well. He was, however, requiring the immediate removal of Trent Halbrook from all project roles, the full restitution of Evans' incentive payment with applicable interest, and an independent audit of all Carrington project personnel records for the preceding 3 years. Helena, who had been listening with the focused attention of someone assembling a picture from pieces she had previously been given separately, asked Avery to remain after the room cleared. Avery produced a document she had prepared that morning, a summary of 6 other employees whose incentive payments had been reduced or eliminated through similar mechanisms. Minor policy violations elevated into disqualifying events at the moment of payment, all within projects that had subsequently generated management performance bonuses. The pattern was not subtle once you looked for it. Helena had not looked for it because the reports she received had not suggested there was anything there to find. The final board session was held at the Carrington Tower, in the room on the top floor that was reserved for decisions of a certain weight. Trent made his last presentation in that room, and it was, by most measures, his best. A coherent argument that the decisions he had made were within the scope of his authority, that the project had ultimately succeeded, that the client relationship remained intact, and that sacrificing a loyal manager to satisfy the demands of a contractor and a disgruntled employee set a precedent that would damage the company's ability to manage projects in the future. He said it with conviction, which was the only currency he had left. Evan had been asked to present as well. He did not begin with his circumstances. He did not mention the mortgage, or Sloan, or the 4 years since his wife's death, or any of the personal weight he had been carrying through those 30 nights. He began with the staffing cut and its effect on the integration timeline. He walked through the overtime records and the sequence of architecture decisions. He presented the acceptance criteria from the contract annex and the timeline showing when the bonus reassignment paperwork had been created relative to when the photograph had been taken. He showed the change log from the unauthorized update and the administrator credentials that had authorized it. He displayed the full text of the email fragment that had been distributed to journalists, and then displayed it again in its original context. He described the external code module and the data transmissions and the registration chain that connected the vendor to Trent's family network. He showed the server log from the handover event and identified the timestamps, showing Trent had been aware of the transmission protocols for 22 days before the ceremony and had not disclosed them. Nolan confirmed the technical sequence. Avery presented the financial flow analysis and the 6 parallel cases. Conrad Wainwright stated, without prompting and without being asked, that he had failed in his basic responsibility as a financial officer by approving a payment adjustment based on a summary rather than the underlying documents, and that he understood this to be an accountability failure rather than an error of judgment, which was a distinction that mattered to him. The auditing firm confirmed that the evidence did not support any version of events in which Evan had contributed to the handover failure or used system access as leverage. The board voted to terminate Trent's employment, refer the record to external counsel for assessment of fraud, breach of contract, and conflicts of interest, and initiate the expanded audit Avery had recommended. Helena announced at the end of the session that the conduct she had witnessed reflected a structural failure in Carrington's internal oversight, that the company had built an environment in which management reporting was trusted more than primary evidence, and that this was a failure she was accepting personal responsibility for correcting. She outlined specific changes. No direct manager would hold unilateral authority over a subordinate's incentive payment. All compensation adjustments would require review by an independent panel. Mandatory overtime would be tracked and capped. Employees working night shifts would have access to adequate rest facilities and meals. Critical system changes would require authorization from at least 2 independent levels, and employees who reported misconduct would be protected from retaliation by policy that had enforcement mechanisms rather than just language. The expanded audit took 11 weeks. It confirmed the 6 cases Avery had identified and found one additional instance that had been obscured behind a contractor reclassification. Carrington paid restitution to all 7 employees, with interest and a settlement for the contractual violations. Evan received his $110,000, the accrued interest, and a separate payment reflecting the breach of the incentive agreement's terms. August made him an offer during the last week of the audit, a position as Director of Systems Architecture at Blackwell Infrastructure, overseeing safety and redundancy standards across all the airport and logistics facilities in the group's portfolio. The salary was high enough that Evan did not immediately register it as real the first time he heard it. He asked for a week to consider it, and then spent that week finishing the documentation for Aegis Flow's ongoing operations team. The training manuals, the escalation procedures, the annotated architecture guide that would allow a competent engineer to maintain and extend the system without needing to hold the entire map in one person's head. He had been concerned about that dependency throughout the project, had raised it in emails that now formed part of the evidentiary record, and he was not willing to leave the problem unsolved simply because the solution was no longer formally required of him. When the team was trained and the documentation was complete, and he was reasonably confident the system could run without him, he accepted a modified version of August's offer, not a role inside the Blackwell operational structure, but the directorship of an independent safety standard center with direct reporting authority to the client board, rather than through any single vendor's management chain. It was an unusual arrangement, and August agreed to it because unusual arrangements are sometimes the honest response to what the evidence has shown. The $110,000 went directly into 3 purposes. The mortgage arrears were cleared, the remaining medical debt from 4 years of treatment and the months that had followed was retired, and a college fund was opened for Sloan with enough in it that the number would not be a variable in any decision she made about her future. Evan did not change anything else about how he lived. He did not buy anything large or different. The house was the same house. The kitchen was the same kitchen. 6 months after the handover event, Aegis Flow was running at Blackwell International without an incident of significance. The system had handled a severe weather diversion event in its 3rd month of operation. 47 inbound aircraft rerouted across 2 alternate airports, and then back again over an 8-hour window. And the redundancy bridge layer had performed exactly as it had been designed to perform, maintaining synchronization across all 3 of its parallel data paths without a single manual intervention. Rebecca sent Evan a message that contained only a number, 47, and a period. He understood what it meant. The recognition board installed in the main operations center listed every person who had contributed to the system. Engineers, testers, coordinators, the night shift staff who had run 1,000 simulated scenarios and submitted their findings in terse overnight reports. Nolan's name midway down the column in the same size type as everyone else's. Trent's name did not appear. Neither did Evan's as a singular credit above the rest. The board listed a project and the people who had built it, and it left the hierarchy out of it. Evan had used the settlement funds to keep the house, and on the evening he finished the last of the documentation handoff he came home before 8 o'clock, which had not been routine for longer than he could immediately calculate. Sloane had made dinner, and she set a bowl of plain white rice porridge on the table in front of him when he sat down, not confrontationally, not as a wound, but as the kind of teasing that is only possible between people who have come out the other side of something and found that they are still themselves. Evan laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that arrives without effort or performance, and for the first time since the photograph had been taken at 2:14 in the morning, the sight of a bowl of congee did not carry any weight other than what it actually was. Helena had converted a storage room adjacent to the main server hall into a rest facility for overnight staff, reclining chairs, a proper food warmer, a small refrigerator. On the wall above the door, in the same typeface as the recognition board, she had installed a single line of text: "No project succeeds when the people who complete it must forfeit their health and their dignity to prove they deserve to be there." August asked Evan once, during a site visit in the spring, whether he regretted not leaving Carrington earlier, not getting out before the 30 nights and the photograph, and the lost bonus and the fabricated email fragment. Evan thought about it for a moment with the genuine consideration he gave to questions that deserved it. He said he had not stayed to save the company. He had stayed because the system he was building would touch the safety of aircraft and the schedules of hundreds of thousands of people who would never know his name, and because the engineers who had worked beside him did not have the documentation and the position and the paper trail to protect themselves the way he ultimately had been able to. He had stayed long enough to ensure that what was built was sound, and then long enough again to ensure that what had been done could not be hidden. The conversation moved on, the way conversations do when an answer has been given that is both complete and true. The story ends. On the first evening, Evan came home while there was still light in the sky, sat at the kitchen table across from his daughter, and understood that the largest bonus he had recovered was not the $110,000, though that had mattered, and he was not pretending otherwise, but the right to account for his own time, his own labor, and his own worth without anyone's hand in the calculation but his own. The bowl of congee sat between them on the table, the small ordinary thing that had started everything, the bowl his daughter had sent to a building 12 miles away because she was 16 and out of better options, the bowl that had become a photograph and a file and a false pretext, and then, in the end, the first thread that unraveled the whole design.